Okay, so for my talk today, I plan to begin where I left off in a way. Last time I spoke, I talked about the Ariyavasa Sutta, the Abodes of the Noble Ones, which I know you've heard from various teachers before. And in his explanation of the Ariyavasa Sutta, Mahasi Sayadaw said that as we practice, he said that the first abode of the noble ones that we work with in the practice is to establish the guard of mindfulness. This is our practice of satipatthana. We note at every arising, always guard the mind with vigilant mindfulness. We try to observe all the phenomena that happens within our being. In summary, the Buddha said that what we should do is sato sampajano vihareya, that we need to dwell, being mindful and comprehending fully. We try to become aware of all the things that we can experience, seeing at the eye door, hearing at the ear door, smelling at the nose door, tasting at the tongue door, touching at the body door, and then various mind objects that arise at the mind door. But of course, we can't just open ourselves to all these 6 objects, all the types of experiences that come up until we develop our awareness and our concentration. So we start with observing things that are very gross and simple. And we use in the Mahasi method, we use the primary object in sitting of observing the rising and the falling of the abdomen. If there's nothing special happening, then we just keep on returning to observe this, the rising and the falling of the abdomen. And as we do this, we have to make effort to put our attention on that primary object every time it happens. And we also need to aim the mind so that we can connect with the rising movement and the falling movement precisely. So this is a very general explanation of the practice because I think you may know all the method. So I'm not explaining in detail. And I hope that will be appropriate for you. The first thing we do is try to establish the guard of awareness. And then as we do this, there are 4 supports for our practice. This is another one of the abodes of the noble ones. So what are the 4 supports? Well, the first thing is that one thing needs to be contemplated and relied upon. That means that we need to rely. There are things that we need to rely on in the practice, and we need to rely on them appropriately. So what are these? These are the 4 requisites. The robes, for example, as a monk or as a nun, the robes, we have to wear clothes. If we don't wear clothes, we'll be exposed to cold and heat unnecessarily. So clothing should be used appropriately. Then there's food. We should use food to support our bodies, use it appropriately. If we starve ourselves, we won't have the energy for practice. If we overindulge in food, we won't be healthy and we won't have the physical strength and the mental strength to practice appropriately. So we have to use food appropriately. Then we need shelter. If we don't have any shelter and we just live out in the open, we'll be exposed to heat and cold. We could be biting things, insects, whatever. There are many types of dangers that having a dwelling will protect us from. So we need to use a dwelling appropriately. And then also there are times when we are sick. So we need to use medicinal supports in those times. So this is the first support for our practice as we try to observe and establish our guard of mindfulness. We have to rely on the four requisites. And then there is one thing that should be contemplated and endured. That means that we need to tolerate things that should be tolerated. For example, sometimes it's colder than we like. Sometimes it's hotter than we like. There are sounds in the environment that are not quite so pleasant, or there's speech that's not quite so pleasant. Those are things that should just be tolerated so that we don't give up our effort to observe. And also pains when they arise. We have to observe them rather than shifting just to move, to relieve them. Of course, if we can change our posture mindfully, it's also all right. So there are these things that should be tolerated. And then there are things that should be avoided. For example, basically, we shouldn't go to places that are dangerous. We should avoid dogs that bite, for example. If we find a dog, then it will cause us a lot of pain, injury, and it will affect our practice. We should avoid going to the edge of a cliff. We might fall off. We should avoid walking through a thorny area. We can get injured by the thorns. We should avoid aggressive animals, aggressive people. And we shouldn't try to play the tough guy when we're meditating. We shouldn't think, oh, it's all right, I'm practicing, nothing can harm me. We don't want to endanger ourselves unnecessarily. And of course, when we are on retreat or when we take robes, we should avoid things that attract us or people that attract us. We should avoid, for people who are heterosexual, we should avoid contact with people of the opposite sex that can make us feel attracted. We should avoid getting too close. So basically, there are things that should be avoided. Just avoid going to dangerous places. That's all. And then there are certain things that should be rejected. This is also a support for our practice. What should we reject? Well, we should reject thinking about enjoying sensual pleasures or thinking about or wishing for another person to die. And we should avoid thoughts of tormenting others physically or of tormenting others verbally. What does it mean to reject these things? Well, we should simply note them until they pass away. We shouldn't dwell on them. We shouldn't accept them or entertain them. But it's not easy to reject our thoughts. It's not easy to not accept them. It may sound easy, but it's not. It's very difficult. Because if you take, for example, thinking about enjoying things that we like, enjoying sensual pleasures, whatever it is, whether it's a comfortable seat in a plane, whether it's a good dinner or a good breakfast, nice clothing, and so on. Okay, people who are used to thinking about things that they like, they feel that thinking about these things makes them feel good, which is true. I mean, I was just thinking about a trip that I have to go on, and I was thinking about the seat that I was going to have on the plane, because I have a physical problem at the moment, and I had to spend extra money to get a comfortable seat so that I could be sure my injury wouldn't be aggravated. And my mind kept on thinking about that comfortable seat. You know, that's what our mind does. So these are small things, but that type of thinking about something pleasant, it makes you feel good. And people who don't practice, they think that this thinking is them. It's their internal self. So when people come to practice, we tell them, okay, you have to note the thought. You have to note thinking. And at first, it's a big burden for people to do it. But after a few days, then it starts to feel, people get used to it. So these four things are supports for our practice: to rely on the four requisites appropriately, to tolerate the conditions that should be tolerated so that we can persevere in our practice. And then I have to find my note, to avoid things that should be avoided, basically avoid dangers, and then reject things that should be rejected, like these harmful thoughts of ruining other people or tormenting them, or thoughts of our sensual pleasure, and so on. So we put our attention in the sitting, we put our attention, try to sink it into the body, to observe the phenomena that arise there, beginning with the rising and the falling of the abdomen. We try to observe that rising movement from the very beginning until the end. And we try to observe the falling movement from the very beginning to the end. Just keep on doing that again and again, every time it happens. As we do this, what is the first thing that we start to encounter in our practice? We start to encounter these bad things called the hindrances, the nivaranas. Because at the beginning of our practice, our awareness and our concentration, they aren't strong enough yet to control the mind. So the mind wanders. It wanders to where it is used to going. And these wanderings are called hindrances. We have to remove these. So these are the first three of abodes of the noble ones that Mahasi Sayadaw talked about in talking about the Ariyavasa Sutta. First of all, to establish the guard of mindfulness, or sati, to rely on these four supports, and then to remove what are called the five hindrances. Those things have to be removed. Well, how do we remove them? I mean, we have to recognize them and reject them. Basically, we have to note them. The first of the hindrances is the hindrance of sense desire. When we feel desire for something, it's like being in debt. And I think I probably said this same thing last time I talked, but I'm going to say it again. So we feel we can Why is it like being in debt? Well, when we have the desire to have our habitual cup of coffee or habitual cup of tea, for example, we want to go get it. As long as that desire is there, we're going to feel the urge to act on it and go get that cup of coffee or the cup of tea. And okay, why is that type of desire like being in debt? Well, if you think about, especially in the old days or in the present days too, sometimes people borrow money, and then when the lender comes to collect the payment, well, you have to give it. You have to give it, and if you don't happen to have it, you have to appease the lender. You have to, you can't refuse the lender. They can threaten you, and you have to put up with it because you owe them money. So it's a little bit like that it's a lot like that when we have sense desire, because we want to give in to it. We want to satisfy it. And so that when sense desire comes up, we have to observe it. If we observe it, then we are establishing the guard of mindfulness every single time. With every observation, it becomes weaker and weaker. The tendency towards it becomes weaker and weaker. And finally, since whatever arises passes away, it also will pass away. The second hindrance is anger. Anger is like a disease. What happens when we're sick? Well, we don't have any appetite. We don't have any energy. And we don't know the difference. If somebody's saying something to our benefit or not to our benefit, we don't know the difference. We just feel like we want to reject it when we're angry. So just like a sick person will push away any type of food, an angry person just pushes away what it encounters, whatever it sees. So this is anger in particular is very destructive. The word dosa means that it destroys the mind. And if you, for those of you who study the Abhidhamma, you know that the feeling of anger, technically speaking, is based in the heart. So that's why people who have a lot of anger tend towards heart attacks, because this emotion in particular, it's a mind state, but it has a strong effect on the heart. It's based on the heart. It doesn't arise elsewhere. Other emotions can arise elsewhere. So anger is also an emotion that we have to, when it arises, we have to note it. And in particular, too, one thing that Mahasi Sayadaw spoke about was the importance, even if we didn't observe any other of these noble abodes, of which there are 10, if we just could control our anger, it would be enough. It would be really good. What happens when people get angry is, well, first of all, the mind sees something that it doesn't like, and then you can feel a physical change. Like people's face sometimes gets red. You can feel you get hot. And if we can be aware of it when it's at that stage, and without going to words, then it's very good. But sometimes then people speak in anger. So they say something angrily to another person. Okay, and that isn't pleasant for the other person to hear, and it doesn't feel good to say. So we should try not to let it go to that point. But if it does get to words, we should try to stop it right there. We should try not to go further. Stop talking. What happens if we don't stop at words? Then one person hits another, and that will really destroy the relationship. So and the problem is that when we get angry, who do we get angry with? We get angry with people who are close to us. And the people who are close to us, our families or our neighbors, our close friends, our work companions, and those are the people that we need to rely on when we need help. So those are the people who we should, even more importantly, avoid getting angry with. We don't tend to get angry with people who are far away from us. We get angry at those who are around us. So anger is particularly destructive. And in addition, it disturbs the mind a lot. We won't be able to get concentrated if it arises. So we have to observe it. It's angry, 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 etc. Angry, angry, angry. Keep on observing it until it will eventually go away. Then there's sloth and torpor, which is like being in jail. Sleepiness, sluggishness are like being in a jail, because when we're in jail, even though if there's a party going on, a street party, for example, we can't enjoy it because we're in jail. We're locked up. And when the mind is dull, retracted, it pulls back, it closes up, it gets sleepy, then it can't observe the object. So when the sleepy feeling, whether it's you feel it in the mind or you feel it as the body nods, you have to observe it. There are remedies for working with sleepiness too, but the first one is to observe it, to observe. Then I'll talk about antidotes in a while. Well, the antidote for sleepiness is to sharpen your attention. So if people don't mind my going into the 7 ways of working with sleepiness, then I will mention them if it's not boring for you. Even people who are enlightened can feel sleepy when they practice meditation. And this happened to the Venerable Mahamoggallana. He was already a Sotapanna, and he was working to go further in his practice, but he was nodding. So the Buddha saw him nodding, and he asked him, Venerable Moggallana, are you nodding? And he said, yes, Bhante, I'm nodding, my head is nodding. And so the Buddha advised him, first of all, you have to change the perception. So if you were noting rising and falling when you felt sleepy, then put the attention on something different, like sitting and touching. The whole body sitting, and then, for example, the bottom touching the cushion. Sometimes that act of directing the mind like that will make the mind feel fresh. Then you can go back to observing as usual. Then the second method is to recite something in your mind that you've memorized. It could be a scripture, it could be homage to the Buddha, it could be the Star-Spangled Banner. The Buddha recommended scripture, but if you don't happen to know any, it can be anything that you've memorized. You say it to yourself in your mind. And that act of aiming the mind will wake up the mind, make it fresh again. Then you can go back again to your practice. But if that doesn't work, then that thing that you said in your mind, you can recite it very softly, so that you don't disturb the other yogis around you. The act of making your mind attend to that memorized object, it will make it fresh again. So you can go back again to observing as you were. Then, if that method doesn't work, though, what you can do is you can twist your ear, or you can hit yourself lightly, massage yourself. And when you do that, that brings blood, especially if you twist your ear, it brings blood to the head. It can make you feel awake again. So if you do that and the mind starts to feel fresh, then you can go back to practicing, observing every arising object. But if that doesn't work, what you can do is look at a light. In the place where you're meditating, there may be a light bulb you can look at. And looking at a light will make your mind feel fresh again. So then you can close your eyes again and go back to observing. But sometimes that won't be enough. So you have to then try another method. The next method is to get up and wash your face with cold water. That should wake you up. Then you can come back and sit again. If that method doesn't work, you can do walking meditation briskly. And that should also wake you up, because you're making effort to observe the steps and aiming the mind at the stepping. So it's the act of vitakka, it's the mental factor of vitakka that directly counteracts sleepiness. So that's directing the attention to the object, application of the mind. And if all 7 methods, I think that's 7 methods, if all 7 methods don't work, the Buddha said you should go to sleep. So these are the remedies and the direct opposite of sloth and torpor, sleepiness. Then there's restlessness and remorse. These feelings, odicca kukocha, it's like being enslaved. When a person is a slave, they have to go wherever the master sends them. They can't go to where they want to go. And a slave has to do whatever the master wants. They can't do what they want to do. And it's the same with the restless mind. The restless mind separates from the object. This is called udicca, or this is when the mind is restless. It separates from the object of observation, but it's just a little bit away from it. When it gets scattered, it's as though you were to throw a stone into a heap of ashes. They just scatter all over the place. When the mind is scattered, it goes far away. And when it goes far away, it can think about things like, it can get remorseful. Remorse is when we remember bad things that we did and wish we hadn't, or good things that we didn't do and wish we did. So we can feel remorse about those types of things, the bad that we did and the good that we didn't do. When that type of thought comes up, I wish I'd done it, I wish I hadn't done it, you just have to note it. It doesn't do any good to dwell on the things that you did and wish you hadn't, or the things that you forgot to do and wish that you did. It doesn't produce any wholesome mind state in yourself to dwell on these things until they stop coming up. Sayadaw Upanyatami said, one time, if you've ever done anything bad, you should forget it, because it doesn't help you to remember them. It just makes you feel bad. Good things you should remember as often as possible. You should bring to mind the good things you do. But the bad ones, just forget about them. Sometimes we're taught, to dwell on them, to recall our bad deeds, but in fact, this just makes us feel miserable. So again, the restlessness has to be observed. But in particular, when we feel too eager to observe, when we feel too eager about trying to catch every single arising object, trying to get the mind to observe everything, we feel too concerned, we're overly concerned about our observation. Then the mind gets agitated and it separates from the object in this way. And then the more we get separate, the more the mind is off the object, the more agitated we get. So then we just have to really reduce our expectations and try to just note one thing that is very simple, like just observe the sitting posture. Again, don't let the mind try to observe lots of different things. Just, you have to counteract the agitation with being very, very simple and just accepting whatever you're able to observe. And then the last of these hindrances is skeptical doubt. Having skeptical doubt, did the Buddha really become enlightened? Does this method really work? Is that monk really enlightened? Etc. Skeptical doubt is like being on a long journey through the desert. When you're on a treacherous journey, going through a desert or a forest full of thieves, carrying valuable goods. Say you're going somewhere, a merchant who's going somewhere to sell the things that he has, but he has to get across that forest. He has to bring them through the forest. Okay, then it's very easy to fall prey. And if you're that merchant on the journey and you happen to hear thieves behind you, then you feel worried, and you go fast and you get to a fork in the road. And since you've never been there before, you don't know which way to go. Should I go right or left? If you hesitate at that moment, the thieves are going to catch up. So you cannot hesitate when you get to that fork. You have to just go take one of the paths. It's not any hesitation at that moment will let the thieves catch up to you. And it's similar when you have doubt. You can't reach a decision about what to do. Should I note this object or should I note that object? Should I sit or should I walk? It's easy to fall prey to the kilesas, the mental defilements at that time. So you just have to, again, note, well, what are the things that as we practice, we develop really as we keep on trying to observe the prominent object within us as we do the sitting, beginning with the primary object of rising and the falling. And then as we observe the rising and the falling, from time to time, in between, we notice that there's thinking. We note the thinking. As we continue to observe our main object and other things. Am I going too late, by the way? No. Okay. So then also as we sit for some time, we have pains, aches, we have to observe those. And then also sounds, sights in the mind, other types of objects can come up. So as we base ourselves on the primary object, other things come up and we have to observe them. we use the factors of effort to get the mind to the object and aiming to make sure that the mind connects with the object right as it arises. That's when we'll see it most clearly. So we develop these qualities by working with the primary object. It's not the only thing that we experience, but there are times when nothing special is happening, so we need to have something to observe. And working with this primary object develops the effort to get the mind to the object and the ability to aim precisely. Because the more precisely that we can observe our primary object, the more precisely we will know when the mind has started to go somewhere else. We'll know very quickly that a thought has arisen. We'll know the sight in the mind right away. So the precision, the accuracy of our aim, and the effort that we need, they get developed by working with this primary object. And when we make the effort to observe the object, then that effort, every little bit of effort to observe, brings with it a little bit of mindfulness. The more effort to observe, the more awareness is developed. If we can observe moment by moment, we bring more and more mindfulness. And when that mindfulness is strong enough, it starts to stick to the object. So with accurate, I'm sort of maybe skipping around, this sticking to the object is concentration. It's when the mind is getting concentrated or collected. And concentration is the direct opposite of sense desire. When the mind is concentrated, it's not going to go to some sense desire. It's not going to start thinking about sense desire. So the concentration is the direct opposite of sense desire. Then, as I said, when we aim the mind, the aiming is the direct opposite of sloth and torpor. So the more accurate our aim is, the more we will be able to dispel sleepiness as soon as it happens. Then, when our aim is accurate, what happens is the mind starts to be sustained on the object. So the mind has to connect with the object. That is what we mean by vitakka. It's compared to when you strike a bell, the initial sound. So that is the factor of aiming. When the aim is accurate, the mind is sustained on the object. It stays with it. It's as though it rubs against it. This is called vichara. So there's connecting or aiming the mind and the sustaining of the mind on the object. This is compared to the ringing of the bell after the initial striking. The sound of the bell keeps on going. So this rubbing of the mind on the object causes the mind to know what it is. It doesn't just see it initially, it is sustained on the object. So it sees very clearly what the object is, whether it's a moment of hardness, a moment of stretching, a moment of lightness, a moment of flowing. And this rubbing of the mind, because the yogi knows very definitely what the object is, overcomes doubt. There's no doubt about the object when the mind is sustained on the object. And when the mind is sustained on the object, joy arises. It's similar to the joy that we feel when we can hit the ball in baseball and we get a good hit. We feel satisfied at that moment. That satisfaction is the opposite of anger. So these factors that we develop by applying the practice weaken the hindrances until they stop coming up. Then another factor that we experience when the mind starts to become more and more collected is we feel it's pleasant. It feels pleasant. There's a happy feeling, sukha. And this overcomes restlessness. And so these are the 5 factors that make up concentration. There's vitaka, aiming the mind, vichara, sustaining the mind on the object. And there's joy, joyous interest, piti, sukha, or happiness, and then samadhi, one-pointedness or concentration. So when these factors are activated, the hindrances are suppressed. And this happens naturally as we apply the instruction to observe at every arising. Always guard the mind with vigilant mindfulness. So I hope that you will be able to develop your practice so that you are able to develop awareness, concentration, knowledge, until you develop knowledge to the highest extent and realize full liberation. That's all for today.
Thank you, Sayagyi. Now we can open up to everyone if there are any questions. I do have a question myself, Sayagyi. So
Please, go ahead.
you talked about aim and you mentioned about object. In our life, we encounter many objects, many choices, a lot of decisions to make. So my question is like how to, first of all, like decide which object to aim for, and out of like several objects, how to prioritize.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any advice on that? Thank you.
Mm-hmm. When there are 2 objects that are competing for your attention equally, and one of them is the primary object, give preference to the primary object. Okay. If you're in a situation where there are many different objects that all seem to be happening at the same time, choose one. Just choose one. Okay. And it will go away and then you can choose another. So those are two solutions I can think of.
Thank you.
I hope that helps.
That helps. Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, good. Thank you for asking.